Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Trek Beyond. This video is a part of a series of videos where I review every Star Trek film. In fact, this video will be the final video in that series, for now at least, as this is the latest Star Trek movie. As of this video, I will have covered every Star Trek movie that has been released thus far. So, Star Trek Beyond is the third movie in the Star Trek reboot franchise, even though I know some people say they're not reboots, but come on, they're reboots. But anyway, so this film, I talked about how when I saw Into Darkness, before that came out, I had absolutely no desire to see it whatsoever because I hated 2009 so much. And it surprised me by actually being good. Well, when I heard they were doing a third Star Trek film, I was a bit iffy on it, because although I did give Into Darkness overall a good review, and I did give it a favorable review, I still didn't really see it as Star Trek. It still had a lot of world building issues, maybe not as much as 2009, but it still had didn't feel like a tangible universe yet, and it felt like a silly let's do action or whatever. It had more of a Star Trek feel to it, but as I said, it was more like a cover band kind of feel to it, so I really didn't consider Into Darkness Star Trek either. Star Trek 2009 most certainly was not. Nowhere near Star Trek. So at this point, when I heard there was going to be a third Star Trek movie, still didn't really consider them Star Trek. But Into Darkness was okay, so I was a bit more open to them. So I did plan on seeing this third film. But when I saw the previews for this film, I was disgusted. I was just like, because the preview, in fact, if you heard, came out like recently, like this year, where Simon Pegg was saying that he was very much against the reboots, and the previews for this movie. Of course, Simon Pegg was a writer on this film, and he thinks it didn't perform as well at the box office as the previous films did. And I think relative to its budget, since it had such a huge budget because the other films were so successful, it was kind of a box office bomb, or at least it was seen as a box office failure, even though it did fairly well at the box office. There was no slouch. It made a lot of money, but relative to its budget, didn't do that well, especially compared to the two previous films. And Simon Pegg blamed the trailers, the previews, for that. And I agree with him, because as a Star Trek fan, my initial reaction, especially I already had a bad taste in my mouth from the first two films, my initial reactions in seeing the trailers, my god, this is a travesty. What the fuck are they doing to Star Trek? This is going to be awful. And I heard that they were getting the director from the Fast and Furious films. In fact, instead of writing the trailers, it was like from the director of Fast and Furious. And the trailers made it look like a Fast. I remember, this is the only film that was released when I was actively doing this channel, actively doing Enchantment of Eternity. And I remember talking about it in some live videos I did, being like, calling it like the Trek and the Furious, and how it looks absolutely awful and disgusting, and I was going to see it more out of curiosity. In fact, I do believe, like, on my schedule, the videos I had planned, I had put down trash Star Trek Beyond. I was like already planning on a video. In fact, I think I had this whole gimmick plan. I can't remember what it was, but I was going to do this whole gimmick where I was trashing. I think I was going to come on, like, call it like the Trek and the Furious, and I was going to like trash it and say how like awful and disgusting, how they're spitting and pissing all over the grave of Star Trek, and it is like shameless crash driving. What the fuck are these motherfuckers doing to Star Trek? But when I went and saw the film, I was even more shocked than I was when I saw Into Darkness. I was more surprised. I was like, holy shit. Because in my opinion, this is the only one of the three recent reboot films that actually feels like Star Trek. In fact, I would even go as far as to say this is a Star Trek film. It's only one of the three, in my opinion, that is. And it so feels like Star Trek. And not only that, it is actually a really well constructed storyline, a really well constructed plot, And it has a tangible universe. It actually feels like the Star Trek universe, unlike those other two films, which are just chaotic and blah, 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 and anything could happen. You had to sort of shut off your brain in order to enjoy those first two films. Whereas this film, no brain shutting off required. There was a lot of action in it, sure. And I do know some Star Trek fans who did hate this film because there was too much action. As I said, me personally, I don't mind action in Star Trek. Have all the action you want, as long as it has strong characters, strong story structure, and feels like the Star Trek universe and keeps with the Star Trek themes. This was the only one out of the three films to fully do that. In my opinion, Star Trek 2009 didn't do that in the least. It was just a throwaway garbage blockbuster. It was bleh, all over the place. Into Darkness kind of did that a little bit. At least it had a strong Kirk-Spock relationship. The characters came off a bit more realistic, at least than it did in the first film. But it was still, the universe wasn't tangible. People could beam to one side of the galaxy to the other. They could bring people back to life with Khan's blood, and there was a lot of gimmicks in that film, and it didn't feel like a tangible universe. So it still had a lot of issues, even though I thought it was much better than the first one. This one, huge improvement. Felt like a tangible universe. Had a strong storyline. Now, I actually did do a spoiler-free review on this film when it came out, so people who are watching this now might have watched that, so might already be aware of my thoughts on it, or you can check that out to see my thoughts when I first saw the film. But here I'm going to go on to spoilers, which I didn't do in that other video. Because I was trying to keep it vague. But anyway, let me talk about why this felt like a Star Trek film. And the main thing is the characters. The Kirk felt like Kirk, Spock felt like Spock, Scotty felt like Scotty, McCoy felt like McCoy. In fact, that's what I noticed when watching 2009 and Into Darkness. The one thing they were severely lacking that did not make it feel like Star Trek is the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy relationship. Like I talked about in 2009, like McCoy barely appeared, and Kirk and Spock were like, they hate each other, and he's captain for us all. So it was all over the place. It was really jumbled, horrible. Into Darkness, at the very least, they got the Kirk and Spock relationship right. So I'll give them that. But McCoy had very little to do in Into Darkness, so they left out that trinity. And it's funny because if you watch my review on Wrath of Khan, when Nicholas Myers first called to do Star Trek, when he went back and watched, or Harve Bennett, sorry, he went back and watched the original series and said that was the thing that stuck out to him the most. That was the thing that felt most Star Trek. That was the thing he wanted to capture the most, is the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy dynamic. And the two, J.J. Abrams obviously didn't give a shit about it. He just wants to make something with lots of flashy action. But Simon Pegg, who wrote this film, actually is a big Star Trek fan, and so it seems like this film was written by someone who understood Star Trek and understood the heart of it was the Kirk, Spock, and McCoy relationship, which actually does shine through in this film. This is actually the only film where I think Karl Urban, who's a decent actor, has something to do with McCoy. This is the only film where McCoy actually feels like a main character. He's brought into this trinity. In fact, you get a lot of time with him and Spock on the planet, and you get absolutely golden character interactions between Spock and McCoy. And I think even some people who are a bit iffy on this film, or a bit sour on this film, even had to admit that the McCoy and Spock scenes together were golden. And it's not just that. It's like Kirk really, the way they improved Kirk in this film goes a long way to making it feel like Star Trek, because I love how the film, I know some people who wanted the more actions were a bit disappointed and thought this was a bit more slow paced than the other two, and it was, and that's why it's better. Frankly, not because I need to have slow pace, but I need to have character building. You need to have story building, where especially 2009 is just a collection of action scenes that are so just flow into one. They go for action, blah 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 blah, and doesn't give you time to think, doesn't give you time to relate to the characters. And I think so many people are mesmerized by action, 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 action. They don't get that this is actually a poorly written script. Whereas Beyond, I love the fact that it's slow to get started, because it gets you a handle on the characters. And that opening monologue with Kirk and how he's, his captain's log, and he's talking about how they're going on their journey and how the crew was failing, that felt like Kirk. The first two reboot films, he was just this young motorcycle jock. Felt more like James Bond, really, who just liked to sleep with a bunch of different chicks and defy orders and be like, blah, 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 no, you're going back to school. Don't get me started on that shit. Where his opening monologue here is like, you could tell it was written by someone who understood Star Trek. Somebody who got Star Trek, somebody who got Kirk's character and what he was like. I mean, and to be fair, they did keep some of the sort of rebellious aspects from the first two reboots, but they toned it down and they meshed it with what we know of Kirk. Because Kirk, from the original series, has actually always been, I mean, a lot of people focus on the fact that he's, action hero, he's a fighter, and stuff like that, but he's actually always been a really thoughtful guy. He wasn't a thoughtless, careless, oh, I'm going to defy all the rules guy that he was in the first two films. Now, don't get me wrong. Kirk in the original series always defied the rules, but he did it thoughtfully. He did it with a purpose, and that is the guy we got in this film. It was a nice blend between that, so it didn't feel too out of place, too jarring. Has a sequel, the first two reboots, but it did feel more like actual Kirk. Although they're talking about promoting him to Admiral. He just graduated from the Academy a couple years ago, but let's just leave that part of it aside. That one is not as bad as going straight from a cadet to captain. Not anywhere close, so I can forgive Beyond for that. Anyway, yeah, I love that opening monologue scene, and just not just Kirk, but how he talks about the crew, and you show all the crew. This feels like the original series. This feels like we're Sulu's finding time to do, and they have the different crew members saying, oh, some are making out but the others are not, and it's the effects of long-term space travel. That is something that the original series did handle well and touched on a lot, what it was like for people to be in space long-term. You didn't get that in the first two films because they weren't in space long term. They were just hanging around Earth, and that's also why I like this film a lot, because that they're not around Earth, and I like that it wasn't Earth had nothing to do with it. Earth was not put in danger. They keep going back to that well of putting Earth in danger all the time. Like even Next Generation films did this. So I love that. It had nothing to do with Earth. It was actually the Yorktown which was put in danger, and I'll get more on the Yorktown later. But anyway, Kirk's through story, like the opening line was a great way to establish Kirk, but his through story was, and this is probably the only part of the movie that played on the reboot aspect of it, and I actually did like, because for the most part, this film could have been set in the prime timeline and been almost the exact same thing. There was just a few things like Kirk talking about his father's death and Spock talking about old Spock's death. Like those are the only things that really tied it to the reboots. But other than that, it might as well have been set in the prime timeline, which I, of course, love because I hate this whole Kelvin timeline bullshit. And so maybe that's another reason why I like Beyond better. So Kirk's true story is that, his birthday, and he turned a year older than his father was when he died, and so it's really sort of affecting him and making him question if he should really be in Starfleet. Why did he join in the first place? Because he joined on Adair, and again, this is the reboot timeline, the Kelvin timeline, because he didn't join on Adair in the prime timeline. So it's questioning, is he really doing what he wants to do? And at the same time, you get the juxtaposition of Spock, who finds out that old Spock had died, and this of course was a nice homage to Leonard Nimoy passing shortly before this film, because the third Star Trek film was originally supposed to feature William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy and be about somehow incorporate these older figures into the film, but once Leonard Nimoy passed, I think they scrapped that idea, and so Simon Pegg wrote this script completely different, so they went in a completely different direction, which I actually think was wise. They gave a nice little homage to Leonard Nimoy, who passed. I'm not sure how much sense it makes for it, because they treated it as if Spock just lost his father, but he didn't lose his father. It was like a future version of him. It was like an old version of him, so I don't know why he'd be so sad that an older version of him died. I guess it would make him feel a bit weird, though. But he did kind of see old Spock as a mentor, even though, let's forget about the crap in the first two films. And old Spock was, helping to rebuild Vulcan, and I guess that's another place where this Kelvin timeline bullshit comes into it. And so he feels that now with him passing, that he needs to take up his mantle to try to rebuild his people. In fact, you get him and Uhura breaking up, which again I think was a really nice save. They never should have been together in the first place. But the reason they give for it in this film is that, because there's hardly any Vulcans left, that he wants to he thinks perhaps he should get with a Vulcan to perpetuate the species, which actually is very logical thinking. So I can totally buy it. It's a good excuse to get rid of those two, because they never should have been together in the first place. But anyway, that was an interesting, and I love the parallel in that scene when they're in the turbolith, and Kirk was going to tell Spock this, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, and Spock was going to tell Kirk. They're both thinking about leaving Starfleet, and they were going to tell each other, but they couldn't think about doing it. I think Kirk he wasn't going to leave Starfleet. He was going to get promoted to Admiral and leave the Enterprise so that Spock could take over First Officer, so I should correct that. But he's getting kind of tired of being in space and wants to thinks maybe it's time to retire because he doesn't deserve to be out there. And so I love that parallel and the way these character stories carry throughout and how it affects them, where you jump to the end where they both come to terms and realize that Starfleet is where they belong. Now, I absolutely love how Spock realizes it by going through old Spock things and seeing this picture from Star Trek VI of all the Enterprise crew when they're much older still together, and he realizes that's his family. I thought that was actually a really touching use of this whole feature. I was sure it was kind of a shameless call out to Star Trek VI, but it was a touching that he realized that old Spock, what was most important to him was the Enterprise crew, and that was his true family, and so that he needed to stay with them so he could have that that anchor that the older version of him had. And so I love that. That was really touching. And then of course Kirk, by his interactions with Kroll, which I'll get to later, he sort of realized what Starfleet is all about and that he needs to be the one out there. So awesome character stories, awesome development. Also, as I said with McCoy, we got a lot more of McCoy in here. Not just his interactions with Spock on the planet, because they got stuck on the planet together, which was a nice call, but all of his interactions with Kirk, they actually felt like friends. You got that trio, that trinity, like the scenes with them on the Franklin after they left the planet. You got the Kirk, Spock, McCoy trinity, and a lot of Spock and McCoy, and that was great. Great use of it. And Scotty, I kind of touched on this earlier. This is the only one of the reboots where Scotty felt like Scotty. This is the only one of the reboots where Scotty was actually had a decent amount of screen time. In the first two films, he was out of the film for half of the film. Like in the first one, they didn't even introduce him till more than halfway through. And in the second film, he got kicked off the Enterprise, so he sat out half the film. So this was written by Simon Pegg, so of course he's going to have Scotty in a lot. And there was a couple of things like him hanging off the cliff. It seemed like kind of obvious. Simon Pegg was like, "Oh, Scotty's got to have his hero moments," but I do really like the use of Scotty. He of course meets up with Jayla, which I'll touch on shortly. And that was a nice dynamic that he had with them, bringing her into the group, into the family, and sort of his whole the way he was like ever present throughout the thing, and he was being like Scotty. He was using his ingenuity, his skills to their advantage, and that sense of humor. It felt more in place. Like in the first film in particular, his sense of humor, and in the second film too, felt really out of place. Like he's just a comedian. Like, oh, he's there for comic relief. Who cares about him being an engineer? He can shout the lines, "I give her all she's got, Captain," just so people can be like, "Oh, I remember that from the original series, yay!" But here he actually felt like Scotty. He felt like he would act the way Scotty would act. He used his ingenuity skills, and his sense of humor blended into his character. Didn't feel out of place. Didn't feel like he was just a comedian. It felt natural, and so all the little moments of levity and humor really worked, and they helped build the sort of character interactions and the character stories, which was at the heart of this film. Sulu, Chekhov, Uhura. Now, Uhura arguably didn't appear as much in this film as she did in the first two. I don't really mind, to be honest. I mean, not to have anything against Uhura, but I think they were kind of making her into this big action star, which, I don't know, she never was. I mean, she's still... You might say, oh, you did because you don't want to, see more of her, blah, blah, blah. No, she still contributed a lot to the script. She still used her skills to show that she was very skillful in linguistics, and her interactions with Kroll, she was trying to find an angle, and she's the one that helps come up with the way to defeat him at the end. So she still had a very valuable part to play, but I think the amount of time that she was in it or focused on was right. I'll say that. Sulu, he had his moments. I don't know if I'd say he felt more like Sulu, because he was a bit more present than Sulu ever was in the original series, even in the original films. But I like that. I think it still worked. You had that. He added to the group dynamic, and I love the fact that they introduced that he was gay and he had a husband and they had a daughter together. So that's a nice callback, because we know Sulu had a daughter from Generations, so it's working that into this, and it's saying that he had a daughter with another man. If you know anything, like when this film first came out, George Takei came out and was against this. He was saying it was against Roddenberry's vision for Star Trek and not really being true to it. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to very strongly disagree with Mr. Takei. I mean, I can kind of see where he's coming from, because he kind of thinks, oh, just because he's gay, then that means Sulu's gay, and he's kind of... Because he's an actor, and he's saying, oh, that doesn't mean just because I'm gay that the character I'm playing is gay, and I get that feeling of it, but... as far as it being against Gene Roddenberry's vision, I couldn't disagree with him more. And plus, I think, that's what you're going to complain about? The fucking 2009 was shitting, just took a giant jump all over Gene Roddenberry's vision. Product placement is like a billion times worse than having Sulu be gay. So I think he's completely and totally wrong in that regard. In fact, it's not against his vision, because he had always envisioned a gay character on Star Trek, even as far back as the original series. But of course, I mean, he barely got away with having, people of color on the bridge. There's no way 1960s is going to allow a gay character anywhere near it. Even in the 90s, in Next Generation, he said at a convention that he wanted to have a gay character in Star Trek. So a writer wrote an episode, and it was an analogy for the AIDS epidemic and how that affects the gay community, and it had happened to have a gay couple who was a major part of and that episode never got made because the networks wouldn't touch it. So Roddenberry himself always wanted to have gay characters in Star Trek. He always wanted to be a main part. It's the studios that kept shooting him down. So sorry, Mr. Takei, but you're completely wrong about this. I actually love the fact that they made Sulu gay in this film. It made total sense, and because it is not against and I said this when it first came out. It's not against, because it was never established in the original series that he wasn't gay. So maybe he was gay the whole time. We don't know. I mean, the only thing that's saying possibly is because he had a daughter, but gay people can have daughters too, and he does in fact have a daughter with his partner in this film. So I think the whole thing with Spock and Uhura getting together violates Roddenberry's vision a fuck ton more than Sulu getting gay. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Chekhov, I heard that before this film came out, because this film was released after the actor who played him, Anton Yelchin, sadly passed away before this film actually was released, but he was able to film it before he passed away. And I remember them saying that it was a shame because he didn't have that big of a part. But I thought he did kind of have a big of a part. He didn't have a character story the way some of these other characters did, but I felt his part was actually kind of bigger than it was in the previous films, because he was with Kirk on the planet from the beginning. Because and this is something I love about this film, how all the different characters were split up in different places, and he was like Kirk's right hand man for most of the film until they met up with everyone. But he still had stuff to do after that. So I think even though he wasn't like to the forefront, I think he did have a pretty strong part. And overall, like the ensemble, like way they assumed the crew, portrayed the crew, was by far the best, flat out, of any of the reboots. Not just the reboots, but I say almost any Star Trek film. This does any of them. I think it does one of the best jobs of having an ensemble cast, because even some of the Next Generation films, even some of the original series films, will focus too much on just the captain and first officer, like Kirk and Spock, or Picard and Data, and they leave out a lot of the ensemble and didn't really capture that ensemble feeling, whereas this film completely did. And again, that's helped by the format of them having them split up, so every character gets to play. Uhura has to play off Kroll, and Sulu has to help her escape, where Chekhov is helping Kirk, while he's working on the planet. Scotty runs into Jayla, and Spock and McCoy have their interactions doing that. So it really, and even when they all came together, you had that. It helped to have that ensemble feel, that once they're all together, they're like friends working back together. And that's something that they emphasize, like with that picture from the future. It emphasizes Spock that they are a family, that they showed that, the Star Trek 6 ensemble crew, and then it shows that this crew is ensemble, and the whole film ends with the image of them looking at the new Enterprise being built. And it focuses on the ensemble, which totally works. Anyway, speaking of Jayla, let me get into her now, because she was one of the best guest actors or guest stars they had in any Star Trek film, not just the reboots, any Star Trek film. She was amazing. The actress who performed her did a really great job. The makeup on her was awesome. It looked great, and just she had a character story, and I loved her character story, because she was afraid of Kroll, because her ship crashed there and he killed her family, so he had an axe to grind, and she didn't want to go rescue the crew because she didn't want to go back to Kroll's headquarters or his hideout or whatever, because she was sure that she would die if she went there. And I love how when she's fighting that, Kroll's second in command guy, that he was saying, they're just going to leave you here, which is playing right into her fears, that these new friends she made with Kirk and Scotty aren't really her friends, and they're just surface level. They're just kind of using her to rescue their people, and they're not really going to care much about her, and they're just going to leave her alone to die. And I love how that's counteracted, where Kirk actually risks his life, comes back to save her, and that whole scene where he jumps from the motorcycle and she jumps from the thing, and they grab each other and they beam, and that was such an amazing scene. Not only special effects, but the character driven stories. And I'll touch a bit more on the action scenes later, but what made the action scenes, especially ones like this one, really work is because they were of the character stories that was behind them, that was holding them together. And that was the best example, her character story of it was so gratifying when Kirk actually came back and said, "You are not alone." And just her whole character, and she added a lot of great humor, of course, to it. The whole thing with listening to the 90s hip-hop music and stuff like that, even though it obvious pandering to more modern audiences, it still works because hey, it's a sort of older ship that's more close, more relative to a modern time, so it would have music like that would be more readable. But I still, the way she would joke with Scotty and be like, and just how she was so smart to figure everything out. And that's another thing, getting back to Kirk recently, another thing why Kirk feels like Kirk that I forgot to mention is that because Kirk in the original series was always someone who's very smart. It wasn't just this James Bond action guy who just went out and got into a lot of trouble. He was witty. He could outsmart his opponents. That was one of Kirk's key characteristics, and they played that. They showed that in this film by having him sort of plant the thing that Kroll was looking for into that one crew the alien crew member's head, and faking it out, and so that other spy lady who came into the Yorktown originally, like he was onto her, and so he's totally played her and be like, oh, here's the thing, and then she's like, oh, I'm gonna betray you, you're such a stupid idiot for trusting me, and she's like, well, maybe I didn't trust you, and it turned out that he was just had tricked her from all along. That's the kind of witty, awesome, like Kirk that's Kirk. That is the type of Kirk that we need to see. Not, oh, this guy who just goes out and rides motorcycles and bangs chicks. That is not Kirk's main aspects. His from the original series, his wit and his ability to outsmart his opponents, and I love seeing that aspect of him anyway. And that again, his interactions with Jayla in this film, and how he was willing to go back for her. Absolutely great character stories. Okay, well, now you might think, wow, Mark, you really love this film. Well, not really. Now it's time for me to get into the downsides of the film, and let's talk about the villains. Let's talk about Kroll, because sadly, this villain, maybe not quite as bad as Nero, but it is up there. Like, that was something Into Darkness really had over 2009, is that Khan was actually a great villain. Benedict Cumberbatch was amazing in that film. And again, there's nothing against Idris Elba, because he's a great actor, but this was just a very poorly written part. This was such a flat, two-dimensional villain, and I remember I talked about this in my spoiler-free review, but the scene where Uhura is like saying, oh, Kirk is going to come for me, he's like, I'm counting on it. I was just like, I actually, in the theater, I was like, oh, really? They're going to do that? Is so cliche. That is so been done like a jillion times before. I'm counting on it. I was like, oh, God, yeah, of course he's going to say that. That is just so dumb. But, and also, like, he was just such a flat, and a lot of the scenes with him and his motivations, how he wanted to wipe out the Federation, I just didn't buy. And the revelation at the end that he was, like, the captain of the Franklin, and he was a soldier, like, that was pretty dumb. It was really, in its defense, it was really reminiscent of a lot of original series episodes, like, I can't think of that stupid one with the Constitution when they get, it's like Hassel's U.S. thing, Omega Glory. That's the name of it. And the other one with Garth of Izar, Whom Gods Destroy. So these are examples of Starfleet captains who've gone a bit off the deep end, and they go a bit crazy, and they want to like kill people or whatever. So it's something that Star Trek has done before, and actually I think it is handled better here by having him be the one that he was a soldier, and he was from a time that was more of when Starfleet was transitioning from a military outfit to a more scientific-based one. Now, I know there's a lot of disagreement amongst the fan base if Starfleet is actually a military organization. Most people will tell you flat out it is, even though films like this will tell you it isn't. I don't really care. I mean, sure, I don't really care the distinction. I think when it comes down to it, different writers have come into Star Trek throughout the years. Roddenberry would tell you flat out it's not a military organization, but a lot of other people who wrote Star Trek and directed it do think it was. So that's why it's a very mixed message, because it's the mixed bag of writers behind the scenes who have different ideas. So I don't really care, honestly. But the point is, I did like how they did call out the transition from a more war-based, if you want to put it that way, military organization to a more peaceful scientific exploration organization, how someone couldn't make that transition. And it was a very real, very relatable story. But, I mean, the whole reveal felt a bit forced, and especially like Uhura spotted him from like old footage from the Franklin. It's like, you really, how can you tell? I think one of the YouTube comedy channels made fun of this. It's like, really? How can you tell that's Kroll? He has all this makeup on and looks nothing like him. Because it's, Idris Elba. Oh, I recognize the actor. It looks nothing like Kroll, but it's like, oh, that's Kroll. And like these guys, like Kroll and the other people that had their own language and they talked all funny, like they talked in alien language. Why are they talking in alien language if they're humans? And how they get all this advanced technology? Yes, I know the movie comes up with an excuse. Oh, we landed on this planet that the civilization died, but they had left behind their technology. It's a bit flimsy, to say the least. And the fact that he just go mad and like go kill people, I don't know. I just felt really weak to me. It felt like a very flat character, and that revelation was kind of forced. And yeah, I think this is. I did put him when I did my top 5 worst villains. I did put him on the list. He's a very bad villain and a very cliche. I'm counting on it. So it was. This was the main thing holding the film back for me, is because all the other things, the character stories, everything was great. Also, let me talk about the action scenes, because as I mentioned, like I felt these were much better than the action scenes in 2009 and even Into Darkness, because they helped the plot. Those are the best action scenes. Like the one in 2009, it's just, they bored me to tears, especially that final scene where Kirk and Spock were on the Romulan ship fighting all the Romulans. I was like, oh, because they're just shooting lasers. I had no investment in these characters. I had no investment in the story. They're just bland heroes going around shooting guns, and of course they're going to win because the heroes were here. I was totally invested because these were dynamic characters. I was invested in their stories. I was worried for Sulu because his husband lived on the Yorktown place that the Kroll was trying to destroy. I was tense. I was like on the heels. I was like, holy shit, they're gonna kill his husband. I was personally invested, and they built, even though the villains sucked, they did earn that investment because there was a lot of strong character stories and a lot of strong plot behind the action scenes, and that's why they work. So I don't mind the fact that they have Kirk riding around on a motorcycle, because they earned that. Even though I hate it, it has been established that he rode a motorcycle in 2009, and the way they used it, again, as I already talked about, it used it in a great way to get him to connect with Kayla and conquer her fear and show that he was willing to come back for her. So I don't mind the fact they use a motorcycle, even though you could think of it as obvious pandering to modern audiences. Let's have a motorcycle thing. But it works for the story, it works for the plot. Unlike, say, for example, the Jeep chase scene in Nemesis, which was obviously just pandering, but that's worse because it doesn't work for the plot. It's just thrown in there, contrived. It adds nothing to the story, where this adds to the story, and that's why I can forgive it, and I don't mind that they have the modern action sequences. And that's why I talk about Justin Lin, because as I said, when I first heard he was involved, they're just going to make a Fast and Furious, but I later heard he was actually a Star Trek fan, and that actually shows, and he is good at directing action sequences, but because there's a strong script written by a Star Trek fan, and he himself is a Star Trek fan, he uses his experience with action scenes to actually fit into Star Trek, which I love. I think it really works. Even the shit, at the end of the movie with the Beastie Boys, I fucking loved it. I think I mentioned this in a spoiler-free review too. But when they use they try to find a way to break up Kroll ships and realize they can use radio frequencies to do it. And then Scotty's like, I've got just the thing. That was great setup and callback because they established that music earlier on. And they're calling it back. And it's like, I got just the thing to break it up. So when they play the Beastie Boys Sabotage to destroy all the ships, like, I just watched this review recently where someone's like, so they use the power of rock and roll to destroy their enemies. Oh, that's so cheesy. And to be fair, like, if you had told me that before I saw the film, that they're gonna use a Beastie Boys song to destroy the enemy ships, I'd be like, that sounds so stupid. Fuck this thing. But the way they did it actually worked. And I have to be honest, like, during that scene when they were playing the Beastie Boys songs, I almost cried. Like, even watching this now, I almost got a tear. It made me all warm and fuzzy inside. I fucking loved it. Again, it's because they earned that moment with the strong character stories. They earned, you were personally invested in the characters. You were personally invested in the story. I fucking loved them destroying all the ships with the Beastie Boys. I thought that was one of the most exciting action scenes in any Star Trek film. Come at me, I don't care. I loved it. Also, like the whole fight scene with Kirk and Kroll when they're going through the floating around the gravity, amazingly filmed. The whole, like, you can see the Enterprise going underneath the Yorktown. Like, the whole thing, concept of the Yorktown was great. A good concept to begin with, and the special effects were amazing. It was just, the whole thing was just really well done. And then, of course, at the end, Kirk, decides to turn down getting promoted to Admiral, because even though Admiral, or is it Commodore? I think it's Commodore Christian Avasarala tries to promote him, and he tells Avasarala, no thank you, I will go out into space, and she smiles. Love, Christian Avasarala. Expanse reference for those who haven't seen The Expanse. Anyway, I also like how they built in Enterprise references, because ironically, the one Star Trek franchise or property that wasn't erased by this Kelvin timeline was Enterprise, because the split happened after Enterprise happened, and so they actually this the ship that they're on, the Franklin, was apparently some years after Enterprise, or at least the show of Enterprise, but they did name drop the Xindi and saying, so perhaps like this, what's his face, the captain guy, was actually on Enterprise, because they're the only ones who really got any action with Xindi. So he could have been one of the Makos, because they mentioned that he was a Mako. So he could have been one of the Makos on Enterprise who went off to the Xindi. Also, really tickled me when they mentioned the Xindi. It's like, oh, the Xindi! You actually are a Star Trek fan who mentioned the Xindi. And the Romulan War, which isn't as keeping with Enterprise, but I'm sure that that's established in the original series history. So I think they're just saying it took place some years after Enterprise. And of course, the Franklin itself looks like Enterprise from the Enterprise show, and the uniforms that they had on in the recordings were from the uniforms they wore on Enterprise. So I like all the callbacks and references. I don't think they're shameless at all. I think they really work, and I was very pleased with them. Anyway, let me get to my rating for Star Trek Beyond out of 10, and that is an 8. Extremely good. As I said, great character stories, great action scenes, like from start to finish. I was like on the edge of my seat. The action scenes work because of the character stories behind it, because of the plot behind it. Although the whole destroying the Enterprise thing, like we've seen that done before, and this time it's become almost like commonplace. Like, oh, let's just destroy the Enterprise, we'll just rebuild it. So that kind of annoyed me, and that kind of deflated it. And plus, of course, as I mentioned, the villain was very two-dimensional, very flat, and some of the scenes with him twirling his mustache were a bit like, oh, come on. So that's what holds this film back for giving it a 9, because I was really close to giving this film a 9, because the character stories are so strong, but the villain and the whole, let's destroy the Enterprise all willy-nilly, it's like, they've done that enough. Stop going back to that well. But everything else, tangible universe, stakes you really believe in. So overall, really strong film. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Trek Beyond. So that is it for my coverage of the Star Trek films. But I will be releasing very soon a very short video where I rate all 13 films from order from my least favorite to my favorite. Now, I know I already have like a top 10 Star Trek movie video out that doesn't include the reboots, because other than Beyond, they're not really Star Trek. Beyond hadn't come out at that point. But I'm going to include all 13, but I'll make it really short and succinct, and we'll sort of be building off of the reviews I just did, so I won't talk about the films that much more, because I would assume you'd already seen all these reviews. So hopefully I'll have that video out soon. I'll also cover many other Star Trek videos, as well as videos on other shows like The Expanse, Game of Thrones, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.